Sometimes for these lectures, I begin with a few short updates. I'm going to dispense with that because so many of you have communicated to us that you would like a kind of comprehensive assessment, now that the first 100 days are behind him, of the new United States government of Joseph Biden and what its economic plans are, its programs, its proposals, to put them in the context of American history and the context of American capitalism and the deepening crisis that it faces. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on. It's important not only, of course, for those who are in our audience from the United States, but because of the outsized impact of the United States on the world economy, I believe it will be of interest to all of you from around the world who watch or listen to this lecture. Okay, let's begin. And I'm going to begin by looking first at the proposals to spend money and do new things that President Biden has announced, and his program of taxation to pay for at least part of it. Before talking about what President Biden is doing, I want to remind everyone of an old established pattern in the United States, which has parallels in many other countries. The capitalist system is served by two different political parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. They disagree about how to support and to sustain capitalism. They do not disagree about whether it's appropriate to do so. And that has been true for a long time. The Republicans typically support profit-making enterprises, the leadership of the economic system, in a straightforward manner. By cutting taxes, for example, as President Trump did in December of 2017, when he provided a tax cut mainly to wealthy people and to corporations. And I should underscore, to make the point, that this support for business and the wealthy, typical of the Republican Party for decades, came at the end of a 40-year period, roughly the 80s, 90s, and first 2 decades of this century, when the business community and the wealthy had become more profitable and wealthier than ever before in American history. In other words, the Republican Party's support for corporations and the rich came at the end of a 40-year period, which was a period indicating that a major tax cut was less needed by them than ever in American history. They got it anyway, because the Republicans controlled both the White House and the Congress and were in a position to give them even more than they normally do. The Democrats take a different tack. They are the party that says, wait a minute, it is dangerous for capitalism to keep supporting the rich even after they have become richer, which is exactly what Trump's tax cuts did. It is dangerous to have that level of inequality. It produces bitterness, envy, tension, conflict, and thereby threatens the capitalist system. It is wiser to be a little less generous with those at the top and compensate those at the bottom for their misfortune of having low incomes, low wealth, by providing them with public services, by providing them with supports in the form of unemployment insurance, public school financing, food stamp programs, and a whole host of other accommodations that soften what would otherwise be the hard edges of capitalism. Republicans do it their way, and when they provoke opposition, it goes to the Democrats to do it their way. The problem for the Democrats, of course, has been that to pay for the social services provided to the public, they are often induced to tax corporations and the rich. Not a lot, not very much, but more than corporations and the rich wish. So after a bit of democratic government, the pendulum swings back to the Republicans, and so we have the very comfortable oscillation back and forth that characterized, for example, up until now, the last 75 years of American history, roughly or nearly a century. So now an extreme Republican, Trump, has been ousted, went too far, provoked too much envy, bitterness, tension, and conflict, so the pendulum swings to the Democrats and Mr. Biden. And he's doing what Democrats usually do. He's proposing a whole raft of social programs for the public, with particular emphasis on making life a little easier for poor people, for wage earners, for the elderly, for women and minorities who've had it particularly rough. Very typical for what the Democratic Party has done. It's a bit dramatic this time, not so much because what Mr. Biden is doing is remarkably generous, as I'll show you in a few moments, it isn't. But it comes after a Republican who was remarkably the other way. So the bar is very low for a Democrat, and Mr. Biden, to be fair, has done what Democrats in the past have done. And maybe he's done it a bit more. Let me go further. Given Mr. Biden's long political history, as AOC pointed out in a recent statement she made, given his long history of being a spokesperson for the corporate elite that base their corporations in his home state of Delaware, given his votes on a whole host of issues, foreign policy in particular, one didn't expect much from Joseph Biden, a centrist Democrat, the partner of the Clintons, Obama, and all the rest. So let's be clear. He is doing better and more than his history would have led us to expect. And that brings me to an important comparison that many have made. Is he, that is Mr. Biden and his government, another Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Well, I want to answer that very directly, but with an answer that may frustrate some of you. The answer is yes and no. There are similarities and there are differences, big differences. First, the similarities. When Franklin Roosevelt ran and won the presidency in 1931 and 32, he was a centrist Democrat, rather like Joseph Biden. His race for the presidency that he won was based on a proposal for a balanced budget. He didn't want the government, even though we were then 3 years into a severe depression, what turned out to be the greatest depression in capitalism's history. Even then, he was for a balanced budget, not having the government step in and try to repair what was clearly a badly broken capitalism. But once he got into office and saw how bad it really was, he went further than he had been. So there's a similarity. Both Biden and Roosevelt were centrists, and both went further once they got in and took the full measure of how bad the crash of capitalism was back in the 1930s and the one we are still in now. And just a footnote, as a matter of historical record, These are the two greatest crises of capitalism as a system, both in the United States and globally, 1930s and 2020, 2021. These are historic times. But that similarity has to be offset by the differences between what Mr. Biden is proposing and what Roosevelt did. Nothing Mr. Biden is proposing has the scope, the size, and the social impact of what Roosevelt did. Very briefly, let's see. Roosevelt established in the depths of the Depression the Social Security system at a time when the government had no money and every American family was stressed beyond anything anyone had planned on. The president announced that somehow, somewhere, he would get the money so that every person reaching the age of 65 in the United States would qualify and receive from the government a significant check every month for the rest of their lives. We had never had anything like such a public pension program in the United States. An incredible breakthrough. Number two, the Federal Unemployment Compensation Program. If you lose your job through no fault of your own, the government will give you a check every week for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. It varies. Never had that before in American history. He passed the first minimum wage. And finally, and most importantly, he initiated a public jobs program for the millions of Americans who were unemployed in the 1930s. He hired 15 million jobs and gave those people income, security, self-esteem, a future, and not just for them, of course, but for their families and the communities which they sustained by being able to have a job and earn income. Staggeringly large programs. Mr. Biden is not doing anything comparable to that. Or maybe I should say, not yet. And I'll come back to that. Now let's turn to taxes. When it comes to taxes, I would argue that the similarities are smaller and the differences even larger. How is Mr. Biden going to pay for the social programs in the trillions of dollars that he has proposed? Around COVID, around the American Family Plan, around the infrastructure updating, and so on. Well, he's proposed to raise corporate tax rates from 21% of profit. That's what Mr. Trump lowered it down to from the 35 it was when Trump became president. Mr. Biden wants to bring it back up. He's proposed to 28. Please note, Mr. Biden is proposing to take it only halfway back to where it was, and let me recall for you, it was dropped at a time when corporate America needed it least, because we'd had 40 years of redistributing wealth and income from the bottom and the middle to the top, from individuals to business. That's a very modest proposal. And the Republicans have already indicated they will not support a 28% corporate profits tax. So the compromises are beginning. Mr. Biden has suggested he will compromise. So best guess is 24, 25%. So notice then, dropped as of the year 2018 by Trump from 35% to 21%, ending up with Mr. Biden 24, maybe 25%. That is modest and way less than the kinds of tax rate increases that Roosevelt imposed on corporate America. And the same is true The same is true of personal income tax. Mr. Biden has proposed to raise the personal income tax, the basic one, from roughly 37 to roughly 39.5%. Okay, that's an increase, but it's modest. Let me, in contrast, mention the proposal made by President Roosevelt in one of his last messages to the Congress, his State of the Union message. He proposed a 100% tax on the richest Americans. That's right. In the middle 1940s, the president proposed that every dollar over the top rate, which in those days was $25,000 a year. If you adjust for prices, it would be roughly $400,000 a year. Every dollar you earn over that, said the president, would be taxed at 100%. That is, you wouldn't keep any of it. In effect, it's a maximum income that is being created by such a tax. When it went to Congress, the Republicans went ballistic, as they always do, and yelling and screaming, as always happens, and a compromise reached, which is typical. And what was the compromise? 94%. Every dollar over $28,000 that a rich person earned in the mid-40s in this country, United States, 94 cents of that dollar went to Uncle Sam, and the rich person kept 6 cents. That was the law agreed to by Republicans and Democrats and signed by Franklin Roosevelt, the president. Compare a 94% top rate to the current 39 or 39.5% top rate. They're not even close. What Mr. Biden is proposing is light years from what we achieved in the 1940s under Roosevelt. So please understand, is Mr. Biden more progressive than Trump? No question. Is he more progressive than Mr. Biden had been up until this point? No question. He is. AOC was exactly right in noting that and giving him that recognition, as it did to the Democratic Party. But comparing Mr. Biden to Mr. Roosevelt is crazy. There is no real comparison here beyond the similarities I've noted, because the differences are overwhelming. And now let me get to one more point that is just as important. Both Biden and Roosevelt failed. Let me explain what that means. While Mr. Roosevelt went much further, raising taxes on those most able to pay, corporations and the rich, way more than Mr. Biden proposes. While Mr. Roosevelt did that, and while Mr. Roosevelt created Social Security, unemployment compensation, the first minimum wage in American history, and a federal jobs program the likes of which we had never seen, and that we have never seen since either. While Mr. Roosevelt did that, here's what he didn't do and what Mr. Biden isn't doing either. Neither Roosevelt nor Biden have tampered with, have questioned, have challenged, let alone done away with, the power of a tiny minority, those who own and run the businesses of America, the employer class. Tiny minority, they have the power in this economic system. They gather into their hands the profits that all of us help to create. And they decide what to do with the profits all of us helped to produce. And you know what they do with their profits? Well, sure you do. They used them to hire expensive lawyers. They used them to pay for advertising. They used them to expand their businesses. But here's something else they do. They use them to donate to politicians, to fund the two political parties. And they get the result they want. Nobody messes with their control. And they use their money to put into power the very politicians, and here comes the punchline, the very politicians that undid what Roosevelt achieved after Roosevelt died. Let's look at the lesson of the last 50 years. The New Deal, those things Roosevelt did, well, they were either eliminated, never touched again, or weakened. The minimum wage was allowed to sit there while prices kept going up, so it stopped being the effective minimum wage it had been intended to be. Just to give you one example, the minimum wage today, federal in the United States, $7.25 an hour, one of the lowest minimum rates in the industrialized world. One of the richest countries, the U.S., has one of the lowest minimum wages. Tells you a lot. But it's even worse. The minimum wage has not been increased since 2009. That's 11 years ago, 12 years ago. Every one of those years, prices went up in America. And every one of those years, if the prices went up, but the minimum wage stayed the same, it meant the minimum wage could afford to buy less and less. It was a torture of the workers on minimum wage, nothing short. And why was that done? Why wasn't the minimum wage raised at least to keep level with the rising prices? Because the power of those who control the corporations went to keep in power the people who don't allow the minimum wage to be raised, who don't want it. They undid the New Deal. And by not challenging them, not changing the way we organize our businesses, Mr. Roosevelt failed to do what would have been necessary to make the New Deal stick, to keep it, to make it an enduring change rather than a temporary one. Here's a second example of the same disaster. We are now in the second worst collapse of capitalism. The level of unemployment in our society challenges that of the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, 1933, unemployment officially 25%. Wow. 1 out of 4 of the American working class out of work at the same time. We haven't hit that number yet, but we have another number true for the last 16 months, and it's almost as bad. Over the last 16 months, 82 million Americans had to file for unemployment compensation. Some were only unemployed a few weeks. Some were unemployed the entire 16 months. But here's what we know. When you're unemployed, you dip into whatever savings you have because you have to. You make all kinds of adjustments in your life. You may need to tap your relatives, your friends, your neighbors. You become burdensome on people you don't want to be burdensome to. It's very hard. Now, the total labor force in the United States numbers 160 million Americans. If 82 of them were unemployed for some time over the last 16 months, it means that the majority of workers were suffering unemployment over the last year and a half. That's a staggering number. And during that time, here's what was never done. No government jobs program. Franklin Roosevelt had a big one. We didn't have a big one. We didn't have a medium one. We didn't even have a small one. We had no federal jobs program. Staggering what could be brought down The politicians didn't debate a program. They didn't fight over one. They didn't compromise over one. All of what they did in the 1930s, they didn't do. That's what happens if you don't challenge those who sit at the top of the capitalist pyramid. The owners, the major shareholders, the boards of directors, the CEOs. Roosevelt didn't change and challenge them. And so what he achieved was undone after he died in 1945. And Mr. Biden, whatever he does, since he, like Roosevelt, never questions the organization of capitalism, he too is leaving in place the people who will fight him at every step. And even if they lose and some of the things he proposes become real, they will go to work as soon as the ink is dry on whatever proposals of his get through and undo Biden just as effectively as they undid Roosevelt. See, the lesson of the New Deal, which the Democrats never learned, and Mr. Biden neither, is that you can't stop with a good proposal to spend money, and you can't stop with a good proposal to tax those who have it. Because if you don't change the structure of this system, even the things you accomplish will become temporary and will be undone because you haven't taken that last step because you were afraid to do so. Okay, might it be the case that Joseph Biden will become a Franklin Roosevelt, even if it's understood that he certainly hasn't done it yet? And I think the answer to that question is yes, he might. And why? Because these things have nothing to do. These questions of how far a president will or will not go have very little to do with the individual, or for that matter, the political party. What makes the thing happen or not are the larger social conditions that force certain courses of action and block others. So let's take a look at that. Two things are crucial to understand why Roosevelt did what he did and why Biden hasn't and probably won't unless similar conditions develop that are not here in the United States yet. Let me explain. Two social conditions confronted Mr. Roosevelt that made him act the way he did. One I have mentioned, the collapse of the capitalist system after 1929. It was severe, it was unanticipated. Economists, politicians, academics, people thought that America was an exceptional place where everybody would do better year after year, generation after generation, that the problems of capitalism had been solved in the 19th century, and that the 20th century would be spectacularly growing. They weren't prepared for the collapse of 1929. They didn't know what to do. They were disorganized. They were depressed. It was a cataclysmic break. In a short amount of time, a quarter of the labor force was unemployed. That means every American family had mother or father or sister or brother or cousin or uncle out of work, leaning on the others who were worried about their jobs. Nobody had prepared the culture. You really have to go back and read the novels of John Steinbeck or all the others who wrote about the catastrophe. That was one condition. We have serious economic problems now, but they aren't quite at the level that Mr. Roosevelt confronted. But could they get there? You bet. And I will come back to that. But we're not there yet. But there's a second, even more important difference in the social conditions of Mr. Roosevelt compared to Mr. Biden. When the capitalism collapsed in 1929, the American political consciousness went to the left. There was a spectacular growth of criticism, not just of the unemployment, not just of the poverty, not just of the suffering of families and children and all the rest. There was that, but there was something more than that. There was a recognition that the system was the problem. And therefore, people decided to take extraordinary steps. Millions joined labor unions, the CIO. These were people who had never been in a union before, whose parents had never been in a union. They knew nothing about unions, but they were bitter and angry, and they were willing to join with other workers to confront the people who represented capitalism to them, the bosses, the owners, the operators, the corporate leaders, the big bankers, you know. And so there was masses, millions, who joined labor movements. But even more to the point, millions joined either one or the other of two socialist parties and of the American Communist Party, whose membership, whose social influence, whose spirit at that time was more expansive, more powerful, more wide-ranging than at any time before or since in the history of American socialism and American communism. And finally, there was a coalition of cooperation between the Communist Party, both socialist parties, and the CIO. They worked together. They had disagreements, they had fights, but they had a powerful, effective coalition. And they went to the President Roosevelt, and they basically said to him, you have to help the mass of people. You have to. If you do, you will become a hero. And if you don't, we won't vote for you. And we, communists, socialists, and CIO, we control millions of votes. You won't be elected dog catcher. It didn't have to be said. Mr. Roosevelt was a smart politician. He understood the message. And to make a long story short, that's why we have the New Deal. Roosevelt had to respond. He had no choice. He was forced to by the push from below, demanding Social Security, unemployment compensation, a minimum wage, and federal jobs, and to make corporations and the rich pay for it, because the government couldn't. With millions out of work, with businesses belly up, the government wasn't receiving taxes. It couldn't function. So the money had to come from the rich and the corporations, because nobody else could have paid for it. So that's why it happened. Now we go to Mr. Biden. He doesn't have that. First of all, the system hasn't crashed quite so badly. Crashed a lot, could crash more, but for the moment, not quite so bad. So the Democrats are hoping they can slither through without having to do what Roosevelt did. But more important, again, is the key difference. There is now nothing comparable, politically speaking, to the coalition of the CIO, the two socialist parties, and the Communist Party. The two socialist parties and the Communist Party exist, but they're so weak and so small, they have no appreciable social influence these days, with the possible exception of the DSA, which has been growing quickly, and I'll come back to that. The labor movement is on a 50-year decline. It once represented a third of American laborers. Today it represents barely 10%, and in the private sector it represents 6.5%. That's all. So the coalition that made it happen under Roosevelt doesn't exist now, and therefore there is no comparable pressure on Mr. Biden, and that makes all the difference. He has the space and the time to do very little, a pale imitation of Roosevelt, and hope maybe that's enough, because there isn't the dog nipping at his heels to do more. But that leaves open two possibilities with which I want to end this section of my talk. The economic crisis of American capitalism, for reasons I'll come to in a few minutes, is getting worse. And it could become worse enough to make it more like what Mr. Roosevelt had to deal with. And likewise, the growth of socialism in America, the fact that Bernie Sanders could be a socialist, run for office for president, both in 2016 and again in 2020, and get millions and millions of Americans to feel okay about voting for a socialist, that's a change, a big one from the last 75 years. And the election of more socialists. But boy, do they have a long way to go before they get the kind of power, strength, and coalitional unity that existed in the 1930s. So we're going in the direction to support the progressives, to support their effort is what we should do to build comparable pressure. But we also have to keep an eye on how bad the economic crisis becomes. And we also have to keep an eye on the failure that was also Roosevelt's, not to reproduce it, not to leave intact the corporate structure with that tiny group, that capitalist class of employers at the top, who will undo anything Mr. Biden does even faster than they did it to Roosevelt, because that was the experiment that taught them how to do it faster the next time, and we're at the next time.